Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Proxies, the cultural work of standing in. My name is Professor Lee Edwards. I'm a Professor of Strategic Communications and Public Engagement here at the LSE. And as I say, I'm really pleased to be able to chair this event, which launches my colleague Dylan Mulvin's new book, which we're delighted to be able to present to you all today. We're going to start with a presentation from Dylan. He's going to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. And then we're very happy to then have two respondents. We're very privileged to have Tarleton Gillespie here and Cait McKinney. And I'm just going to check that participants are all in before I continue. I think we still have a few more people to arrive, so I'll just hang on. Okay, I think we can carry on. So thanks everyone for attending. I'm just going to redo the introduction just in case people missed it at the beginning. So my name is Professor Lee Edwards. I'm a Professor of Strategic Communications and Public Engagement here at the LSE, and I'm really delighted to be able to chair the launch of Dylan Mulvin's new book, Proxies, the cultural work of standing in. It's going to be a really fascinating discussion, I'm sure. We're going to start with Dylan, who will talk for around 25 to 30 minutes about the book. And then we're really pleased to have two respondents, Tarleton Gillespie and Cait McKinney. Tarleton is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research New England. He's part of the Social Media Collective research team, studying the impact of information technology on social and political life. And his most recent book is Custodians of the Internet, Platforms, Content Moderation and the Hidden Decisions that Shape Social Media. And he also retains an affiliate professor position with Cornell University. And Cait McKinney is an assistant professor of communication at Simon Fraser University. They're the author of Information Activism, A Queer History of Lesbian Media Technologies, and a 2020 special issue of First Monday on HIV, AIDS and digital media. So we're really pleased to have Tarleton and Cait with us to respond to Dylan. But before I hand over to Dylan, I want to introduce him most importantly. So Dylan is a historian of media and technology, and drawing on methods from media studies, science and technology studies, gender studies and disability studies, he investigates how standards, infrastructures and defaults encode and crystallize the assumptions about human perception and behavior. And it's that fascinating combination of disciplines and insights that he brings to his latest book. He studies the ways, he says, people make the stuff that we take for granted. Prior to joining the department, Dylan was a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research New England, and he was also a member of the Social Media Collective, where Tarleton still is involved. So with that, Dylan, I'll hand over to you and enjoy.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Tarleton. Thank you, Cait. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And a special thank you to Luam and Ben for helping organize, a deep appreciation, as well as to Zoe Glatt. This is the part of the talk where I would normally talk about color bars and market baskets and mock juries and crash test models, but I'm on home turf, and so I'm taking the prerogative to do something slightly different, as well as to possibly be slightly hyperbolic. So I will share my screen and show you what I mean. So when I say I want to be hyperbolic, what do I mean? I think that we live in the age of the proxy. What I mean when I say we live in the age of the proxy, it's not necessarily that we live with more proxies than ever, though maybe we do, but that rather issues of surrogacy and delegation and the trust of the labor of stand-ins are front and central for daily controversies and crises of the present. And though the book is kind of historically oriented around very stabilized proxies, right, standardized representations, things that come to stand in for a very long time, I want to begin my thoughts today with thinking more expansively and about more ordinary stand-ins. So for those of you not living in the United Kingdom, this is asparagus. This is a solution that some supermarkets have taken in this country to the so-called supply crisis and the Brexit-induced shortage of truck drivers and agricultural workers. And there was kind of a frequent social media viral image of empty store shelves that's now been replaced with these cardboard cutouts of the missing vegetables, right? And I want to argue that these cutouts as sort of proxies for the vegetables that aren't there paper over the gaps in a malfunctioning infrastructure. They help us to suspend disbelief, in other words, in the failure of our institutions. Oh, here's some sandwiches. And I think for many scholars invested in the politics of information and data, right, discussions of proxies and stand-ins and proxification are also pretty common, right? We talk about training data and testing data and with the kind of eruptions around controversies that seem to be a result of that training data or those testing data, right? That we then see in kind of the noxious results of algorithmically oriented systems. Or we talk about data doubles, those kinds of profiles, those aggregated profiles that get constructed of individuals from the kind of waste and exhaust of our online life. But if you've looked at the book or you've ever met me, you would know that the spirit of the Proxies book is to think far wider, right? And far beyond databases and networks and the simple politics of data, to think about the larger culture of standing in. So what would that mean, looking at these sandwiches? I think it would mean taking these cutouts seriously, not just treating them as the punchlines to a kind of absurd present, but as artifacts of an attempt to literally fill in the gaps of our crumbling infrastructures and to treat them as starting points for understanding what we might think of as the performance of stability, right? And I'll come back to that again and again. But let's go further, right? Without leaving the grocery store, we can see the larger world of proxification. In the midst of the pandemic, the North American grocery shopping app, Instacart, has doubled its valuation 2 times, right? First from about $8 billion to 17.7, and then again $39 billion when it was raising capital in March, and is worth a little bit more than that now. And what is Instacart, or any of its UK equivalents, which have names like Wheezy and Getter and Gorillas? What are these if not proxies for our own trip to the grocery store, right? An increasingly fraught affair. And I think if we consider grocery shopping alongside the appified economies of workplace sharing and home sharing and ride sharing and even dog sharing, we have an entire kind of economy of standing in. That, of course, immediately gets it kind of wrong, because the apps themselves and the companies themselves are not, in fact, the stand-ins, right? It's the people and the places that are the stand-ins. These apps are brokers. They're brokers of a proxy relationship. And to perform that role of being a trusted delegate, right, the definition of a proxy requires a great deal of labor, finely tuned labor that gains and maintains the trust of those for whom proxies stand in, labor that's newly categorized as essential. It's no surprise then that the workers who work as stand-in grocery shoppers are quitting en masse and refusing to fill the labor shortage that exists, and in some cases unionizing, but that of course is also met with retribution. So yes, this is a world of stand-ins marked by a kind of unfathomable scale of data, the exploitations of an app-based economy, but it's also one that suffuses our popular culture, right? So again, thinking expansively about the kinds of stand-ins that surround us. Like other people during the lockdown, I spent some of my time revisiting the entire Fast and Furious franchise. And if you're not familiar with the franchise, it is a 9-film series about the magic of cars and family and masculinity. But tragically, sometime before the end of the 7th film, Fast and Furious 7, one of the franchise's stars, Paul Walker, passed away in a car accident. The production of that film was pushed back to try to find a way of recuperating what they had filmed of his performance, and eventually finding a way of reproducing his appearance using what gets called AI tools that have been used elsewhere to reanimate other characters in a slew of Hollywood films. Here, 2 cases from Star Wars, and just last month or the month before, to use what gets called a deepfake technology to create a proxy voice of Anthony Bourdain reading letters that he had written but never read out loud. The case of Paul Walker, though, was a little bit different. And that's because the filmmakers used his brothers, Caleb and Cody, as stand-ins, collapsing their physiognomies together and overlaying them on their deceased brother's face. I don't know why exactly I find this example so fascinating and gut-wrenching, but I think it's the intimacy of this standing in and standing for relationship. It's evocative for me of what makes a proxy relationship really a rich site of culture. And here, the kind of delegation to a trustworthy stand-in is marked by a relationship of genealogy, right? An almost kind of invisible eulogy, again, meant to smooth over the gaps in an unfinished film. But like those Star Wars examples and the Anthony Bourdain example, right, a lot of people have reacted quite negatively to this use of synthesis, claiming that it's an example of the uncanny valley, that it's eerie, that it's a form of necromancy, and that it's simply inauthentic. What I want to argue then is that all of this is a part and parcel of the ethics and the politics and the aesthetics and the culture of standing in, right? And if you allow me, I think that living in the age of the proxy requires utmost care in how we delegate and the attention that we pay to the materiality and the labor of standing in. Those are the guiding ideas behind the book. The idea being that by mapping these processes of delegation, of proxification, to use a kind of ugly word, we can map how an institution works and how it's held together. So what is that book? Proxies, the book, begins in the southwest of Arizona, near the town of Yuma, where you can find a small town called Yodaville. It has a town center and 8 boulevards that radiate from the center of it, and it stands in stark contrast against the surrounding desert. Yodaville is totally empty. It's never been lived in, and that's because unless you've just read the first 10 pages of my book, this will be news. Yodaville is a test city. In the terms of the US military who own and operate the town, Yodaville is an urban target complex. And it's also made of shipping containers, which again are those kind of or objects of global logistics themselves, a kind of idealized stand-ins. Yodaville was built in the 1990s. Let's get that there. Yodaville was built in the 1990s as a response to US military deaths in Mogadishu in Somalia. If you've seen the film or read the book Black Hawk Down, as a result of that, the military saw that that failure was a result of bad training, and in particular, bad simulation, and then more specifically, poor representations of the battlefields that they were likely to fight wars in. They said at the time that their training towns were too European and that they needed, quote, a new, this is coming from a Rand Corporation report, a new test city to reflect, quote, the chaotic environments found in densely populated areas of the developing world. Just kind of grim. Yodaville, I argue in the book, is a kind of proxy city for the world out there, right? Imagining in here as the kind of corridors of standardization and knowledge production and performance standardization. So when the US military saw the edges of its empire strained by war in unfamiliar territory, they decided they needed better proxies. Sure enough, when they went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan a few years after Yodaville was built, it changed from anywhere in the developing world to a specific place. One colonel put it, if a pilot can drop a bomb and hit a target in Yuma, he can drop a bomb and hit a target in Iraq. They got heat, we got heat. It is the ideal place to train. So you can see, right, Yodaville began as a kind of plastic or flexible proxy, any number of possible places, and further gets focused into particular places by highlighting features that bring the two places into kind of a common relationship, the heat, the desert, etc. So it can both be a kind of plastic stand-in, while being definitively one place, which is Yodaville, which can be shared as a reference point in evaluating the performance of soldiers. Placed pointedly as well on the border of the continental United States, Yodaville is just one of a series of military encampments on the US-Mexico border. It's situated within the occupied traditional territories of the Quechan and the Cocopah, and it adjoins the Fort Yuma reservation. Right, as such, it's both a stand-in for war elsewhere, while simultaneously serving as an instrument for sustained domestic occupation. And I think by serving that double function, I argue it embodies a very specific fantasy that we can see in the work of proxies, to become without becoming, right, to mediate between. Meaning it can momentarily become a foreign war zone without ever actually risking any domestic occupations. This is part of the promise of proxies, the promise, in other words, of creating those controllable renditions of an unpredictable world. In the book, I begin with a broad and rather naive question that you can see in this example of Yodaville. To whom or to what do we delegate the power to stand in for the world? And to answer that question, I turn to a series of different tools, people, places that become fixed points, standardized proxies in the production of knowledge. Proxies, the argument goes, act as models of the world out there and are necessary components in making an institution run, in producing knowledge, in keeping an institution afloat. And to use the phrase of Hans Vaihinger, they're necessary fictions. So the larger argument is that we use proxies to leverage a representation of our current world to foresee and craft a world to come. Proxies can only do so because of the continued work and embodied labor of the people who maintain proxies, or, as in some cases we'll come to, act themselves as embodied proxies. So by building a kind of catalog of different proxies, of turning to different institutions over roughly the 20th century, the book centers on human bodies, human labor, and makes the following arguments. Proxies are bodily. This is visible in the work of measurement and training that relies on finely tuned, embodied, and relational practices. Proxies are both sticky and permeable, though in uneven ways. They're built almost always as labor-saving devices, a means to an end, a shortcut because you need a shortcut. They stand in for worldly phenomena when we can't go and test everything in the world. They inevitably, though, carry and leave traces of their cultural milieu and the places where they've traveled. And finally, proxies rely on a kind of suspended disbelief. So the scientific and technical expertise that I examine throughout the book is formed and repeated through scenes of performance, where participants in these scenes act as if the stand-in were the real thing, that kind of necessary fiction, in order to get work done, right? It's something we all do. So beyond Yodaville, the book is structured around 3 additional cases of proxies and these are each cases that have lasted an inordinate amount of time, decades and decades and decades. It begins, or the next chapter is focuses on the International Prototype Kilogram, or the IPK, which until just a couple of years ago was the last remaining physical artifact in the metric system, meaning the definition of mass was equivalent to this little piece of platinum iridium. And here I approach the lifespan of that standard measurement reference by examining the protocols, as you can see in this picture, for washing and cleaning the kilogram by hand. So when I was, I've been working on this project for 10 years. And when I started it, I was thinking a lot about measurement, reference, the standard meter, standard kilogram, atomic clocks. And in that process, I found the moment in which the definition of mass changed, where it once said definition of mass is equal to the IPK. There was a moment in the 20th century where they added a comma. It said the definition of mass is equal to the IPK, comma, after washing and cleaning, which is quite a remarkable thing to see in a measurement standard. But because all metals are porous, that little piece of metal both kind of soaked up its surroundings and gave off some of its surface. And so we have these beautiful, incredible instructions for washing and cleaning a kilogram by hand to give it, quote, this is my favorite part, a rather handsome but not specular appearance, right? Rather handsome but not specular appearance. And my hunch, right? My hunch throughout this project has been, if we can talk about kilograms in terms of handsome but not specular appearances, there's something inescapably aesthetic and affective and bodily about the ways we think of data and information. But to think about that outside of the realms we normally do, being the digital. Across the next 2 chapters of the book, I tell the history of now a quite infamous test image, the Lena or Lena test images, which is one of the most widely used test images in existence. It was digitized at the University of Southern California at something called the Signal and Image Processing Institute, or SIPI, in 1973. Many people now know, but it's worth remarking that this image is in fact torn or folded or cropped from the November 1972 issue of Playboy magazine. In fact, the centerfold of the image just above the model's bare breasts. It was digitized on an analog to digital scanner and turned into a 512 by 512 pixel picture of a woman in a hat, but remained for 5 decades, and now is just waning in use as a kind of icon of the discipline of digital image processing, a kind of winking, knowing nod to those who recognized it. Across these 2 chapters, I document the environment in which the Lena image could seem a possible solution to a range of problems, right? The need for a human face, a desire for complex images, a desire for new images, because the engineers had been relying on recycled test images, and the apparent problem of an overabundance, according to the engineers, of so-called brain images. So there's a database, for instance, of tank and non-tank images. And here I look at how all of these needs, right, all of these claims of need become cover for importing mainstream softcore porn into the earliest days of network transmission. In fact, for honing the techniques of sending images online. As I show in the book, the Lena image is just one node in a longer history of using the images of white women to calibrate image technologies. So you can see here that little 4-pack of images is the excerpt from the NTSC standard, which formed a color television standard for most of the world for most of the 20th century. There's a Shirley card image of the woman with the fancy gloves, which was used to calibrate film stock. There's the so-called Jennifer in Paradise image, one of the earliest films to test and demonstrate, or images to test and demonstrate Photoshop. And all of these kind of maintain image standards that are honed to what we could call a prototypical feminized whiteness. And I'm taking prototypical whiteness from the work of Simone Brown and Lewis Gordon, and many other media studies scholars have looked at the use of test images. Genevieve Yu's work on so-called China girl images, Lorna Roth's work on Shirley cards, and Jacob Gabry's recent work on standard images or standard objects. Finally, I look at how this work around the Lena image not only connected this history of feminized prototypical whiteness, but connected a set of research objectives around military guided research into artificial intelligence. So in this image here, you can see this is one of the earliest appearances of the Lena image in the research at USC. And what you can actually see is an edge detection algorithm, which is we would now call a kind of basic step in an AI technique for identifying objects in an image. And this is the same algorithm basically running on 2 sets of images. So there's the Lena image, obviously, and then there's this triptych of a tank, a woman's face, an image often just called girl, and an aerial surveillance image. And it's worth underlining that this research was being conducted and paid for by the US military in the middle of the Vietnam War in an attempt to create techniques for automatically detecting enemies, right? And so what I want to argue is that this is a part of a kind of grammar of control that was being articulated through test image proxies in the post-war period. The final case is the history of the standardized patient program, which began in the 1960s, also curiously at USC, and has transformed over the past 50 years into a required part of medical accreditation. So for those who don't know, standardized patients are actors who embody the so-called normal symptoms of illness or disability or disease in order to train physicians, both in diagnosis and in bedside manner. And the technique began in the 1960s and then kind of moved. It became quite popular in Canada and became a formal part of the accreditation system right at the moment in which malpractice lawsuits were kind of skyrocketing. And it was seen as a way of kind of entraining a new standard of empathy. So for me, this is a story of how human bodies can actually become standardized proxies, right? And traces the way that those bodies, with all of their leakiness and porousness, and in some cases stinkiness, have been trained by a medical establishment to act as relational instruments. And here I'm really interested in the way, so in much of the program, it was a requirement these actors be otherwise healthy, meaning that they should be a blank canvas on which you could encode or inscribe a performance of illness or disability, a form of kind of disability masquerade. And I'm interested in thinking about this as a form of compulsory able-bodiedness, to use Robert McCruer's term, but also as an attempt, and this is, you know, where my larger interest lies in how we can mediate the experience of pain. So whereas those other objects in the book, like a kilogram or a test image, manifest in pixels and metal, right? This is a totally different example, one that's housed in a very idiosyncratic and specific body, right? That has to be maintained in that body and has to account for the weirdnesses and idiosyncrasies of each individual body, and yet, right? And relies on that performance to standardize empathy within the medical system. So finally, I want to conclude. I want to suggest two things. By both standing by and standing in, proxies are taken for granted, right? So one purpose of this project is to say, hey, this thing should be paid attention to, which is kind of the first step of any scholarly project. But I think it really matters what kind of attention we pay to proxies. I work historically, so I'm interested in how these things persist, how they repeat, how they get challenged and then repaired and recuperated, or eventually jettisoned. I'm interested in the kinds of traces they leave, or the kinds of controversies they pick up. So for the Lena image, controversies around copyright and later around sexism. And this is where I think we have to understand proxies as analogies. So they have to function as if they are the thing they stand for. But I think analogies are really unsettling, right? Analogies have no truth proposition. There's no matter of yes or no in an as-if relationship, right? There's only a condition, a time and a place, and a relationship, right, between people or observers or participants in which that analogy can hold. And so a history of proxies, or many histories of proxies, as this book includes, is nothing less, and I hope much more, than the account of how some institutions build institutional analogies for the world, right? How they keep those analogies together, how they maintain them in things like paper and pixel and metal and flesh, right? And all of the work that goes into keeping that analogy viable. And such a project assumes that institutions are built on repetitive, embodied actions, or as Sarah Ahmed calls them, kind of institutional habits, and that we can begin with proxies, or begin with that process of standing in and proxification, to see the ways that bodies move, in what patterns, with what repetitions, right, to map power within an institution. So if I think beyond the standardized proxies in this book to less official, more ordinary proxies, to those cardboard cutouts in the grocery store, or the conversation that the directors must have had with Caleb and Cody Walker, right? That kind of phenomenological experience of being asked to perform as if you are your brother repeatedly for the kind of technological marvel that is the Fast and Furious franchise. I'm starting to think beyond the methods that I used in this book, right? To imagine other ways of getting at that proxy labor, a form of labor I think we would now call infrastructural, right? Labor that's invisible, not because it's actually invisible, but because it's scrubbed away from view. So for me, kind of dwelling with that human cost and the unbelievable difficulty of actually choosing a stand-in, actually scrubbing away that labor, washing and cleaning it away, right? The kind of itchiness that results when we really look closely at our analogies, that's where the politics of proxies are located, and why I've done this project. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all for being here, and I'm looking forward tremendously to this conversation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dylan. That was really fascinating, and it's a real privilege to kind of hear how your ideas have unfolded over the last decade, in fact. Let's go straight to our first respondent, Tarleton Gillespie. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Dylan. Before we get into the conversation, it's really important that we kind of remember that this is a coming out party for your book. This is a celebration of its arrival. as best as can be accomplished under these circumstances. So this is an enormous accomplishment. And I think I speak for everyone in the room that there's a hearty congratulations for having done this, to carry this through. It's such a tremendous book. And I'm looking through, you may not be able to do it because you're presenting and such, but I'm looking at this list of people. We of course should all be there, clinking glasses and waving our copies of the book and being excited for you and shaking your hand. And given that we can't do that, I feel in some ways like I want to be a stand-in for all these people. I don't recognize everyone's names, certainly the ones I do. You've got LSE colleagues, you have friends and admirers from the field. I'm certain you have students among this pile. There's even a Mulvin in there. And I know that we're all sort of wishing that we could fully congratulate you for having done this. And we're getting as close as we can. So I hope you appreciate that. This is a remarkable book. If for no other reason, I can tell it's remarkable for another reason, because I now see proxies everywhere. I think you've made me into someone who's going to notice the cardboard asparagus walking down the grocery aisle and think proxies and get excited about it. And I think for those who haven't read the book or haven't encountered this idea until now, a really intriguing technique for thinking about the way infrastructure that might seem invisible isn't exactly. And so the ways that you find these moments that sometimes you had to find because you had to dig into an archive, sometimes they were sitting there and we just didn't realize the role they were playing, and you helped us understand that. And I find I'm always drawn back to the Lena chapters, not because they're the best, but because I think you offer an analytical exercise to people who aren't studying proxies, but are studying a field and don't know how to ask a question about what makes that field tick. And so the Lena chapter is closest to the things that I think about anyway. But the ability to say, maybe there's a history here of these values being tangled up that we can study, not by looking at like big loud debates about those values or their erasure, but the way that they live and persist in these objects and standards. So I recommend that. I think there are probably scholars of health and technology that are going to just like eat up this chapter about standardized patients. Like it offers an analysis for each field as well as a kind of theory of proxies as a whole. So the question that I wanted to pose, because I'm intrigued by the cardboard asparagus, which of course I'm seeing for the first time. I'm hoping that you at some point tried to buy the cardboard asparagus. Like I think I like the idea of you walking up to the counter, trying to buy the cardboard asparagus, having them tell you it's not asparagus, and you say, no, I understand that. I want the cardboard asparagus. Is there a price at which I can purchase your cardboard asparagus? So that's a missed opportunity if you haven't done that yet. So I'll put that on your to-do list.
Just think of the nectar points I'd get.
Exactly. Right. All right.
It's a Sainsbury's joke for the UK audience.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So part of the examples that you spend the most time in the book on, the kilogram, the Lena image, the standardized patients, it seemed to me as I was encountering those that this might be a story not just about proxies and what they do, but a story about our obsession with standardization and what is required, right? And part of me was thinking, like, if we weren't so obsessed with standardization, if that weren't a priority in these knowledge productions, would we end up producing the proxies that we need? I want to add a side to that, because the cardboard asparagus is much more ephemeral. It's not the kilogram that must stay in a special place and be treated a certain way, and that the persistence of the object is the thing that makes it reliable, sort of, or the Lena image, which like was ephemeral and yet then persisted for decades. You were suggesting the asparagus are kind of like covering an absence, and I think in a weird way that made me think about the standardized patients a little bit, right? Because the standardized patients are offering a doctor someone other than an actually sick person, right? Which would be a training opportunity, but raises ethical questions of like, you don't submit a doctor who's not ready to real people. So they're covering a gap, right? But an ethical gap as opposed to a kind of like commercial institutional gap. So maybe the question is like, how do you, if you want to hand students an ability to kind of like use proxies as a tool, identify them and use them as a way to see things, help me think about the kind of tension between the standardization, the thing they offer to standardizing, and the thing they offer to kind of like absence filling. Are those two dimensions? Are they two kinds of proxies? And are they telling us something about our obsession with standardization and our need to cover absences? Or are they there anyway? And that's just, you know, where you find them best.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tarleton. So what is it about standardization and then covering absences?
Dylan, would you like to answer that now, or would you like to hear what Cait has to say first?
Maybe I'll hear what Cait has to say first.
Cait, over to you.
Sure. I mean, I just also want to say congratulations. This is such a tremendous book in terms of what it offers to the field, but it's also a really beautifully written book. And there's just so much care present in the level of analysis in the book. And it's something I really admire about you and how you do media studies. So the question that I wanted to ask is, I think, you know, part of the work that the book does, and Tarleton talked about this, is you recover the labor that goes into making, you know, some objects stand in for bigger things. I have two kind of favorite moments from the book, and one is an image you showed, which is the cleaning of the kilogram with a chamois, or as we call it in North America, a chamois, you know, which you also use to clean cars, to give another Fast and Furious nod in this lovely launch. And the other moment I love is when you explain what a centerfold is on page 77, which is a sort of like teaching media history moment, but it's also work you need to do to recover like that moment in the lab where someone makes a decision to tear out part of a centerfold. It's like a gesture, and it's minor in many ways, but it becomes so significant. So there's this real attention in your analysis to gestures and everydayness. And what I'm interested in around that is how you attend to moments of caring for objects and caring for others. Like for me, I see this book as contributing to a reemergence of an interest in care in feminist media studies in our current moment. So you talked about cleaning a kilogram, stocking shelves, grocery shopping for someone else, training a standard of empathy in doctors, feeling less sad that Paul Walker is dead because of proxy intimacy with his brothers, who of course are named Caleb and Cody. And I see this book again as part of this care turn or return. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how we think of proxies as sites of care, and why are care and caring practices so important for understanding standards in a new way.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much. Okay, so Tarleton, you think about, you ask me about how proxies can help us get at standardization. I mean, I came to this project because of a research question I was posed by my supervisor to find out something about television standards, which turned up those images that were used to standardize the NTSC standard. And my kind of disbelief that the most pervasive moving image standard of the 20th century, which is NTSC color television, was based on 27 still slides, right? That still images were the basis of this moving image standard. But additionally, that there were these super strange representations of pastoral American life, that they basically didn't represent electricity in any way, and that they were meant to encode normal human vision, right? That they're supposed to capture how people are imagined to see color, that they include various amounts of green and blue and red. And so they were all of these things, right? They're this entire amalgamation of both cultural and technical desires and assumptions, right? And immediately any division between culture and technology when you're talking about those images is a phony one. And for me, standards have always been fascinating because of the way that they kind of have to be insistently normative. They have to finally say, okay, this is how things are going to work, right? That's why they're such rich sites. If what you're invested in is a kind of cultural studies of technology, which is to understand how power articulates different facets of life, technology, technique, labor, form, and this kind of cultural we call it representational or aesthetic content. So that for me is how proxies, which exist in any kind of standard, you have to have a kind of model, right? Can be a way in. It can be a loose thread for sort of picking at that process, understanding that insistent normativity, right? And there are lots of people who have done similar things, looking at model test organisms like the Drosophila fly and Robert Kohler's work, or working objects. But for me, like, this work lines up exactly with what Cait's describing, which is not just to study working objects as these idealized representations of the world or as model organisms, but as a way into thinking about the work people are doing to try to take care of each other, or when they're invested in an institution, right? And so I think there's lots of reasons to get rid of the Lena image, and it's now basically unusable because it's become noxious. But it is, its history does show this attempt to try to take care of people in the field, right? So this moment in the fourth chapter, this moment when a kind of community of feminist computer scientists just start talking about their work environment and documenting, for instance, just the pervasiveness of porn, and the lack of input you have in choosing a test image, which becomes like, these test images or a test sequence becomes like the thing you have to look at all day, every day, right? As you're processing and processing and processing. And one of the editors of an image journal who rejects a call to stop using the image says, like, who knows, maybe one day we'll have image algorithms that aren't attuned to Lena. And he says it kind of facetiously, right? And for me, that's the really telling moment, because it totally erases the fact that it's not the algorithms that are attuned to Lena or Lena, right? It's the people doing the work, right? It's the fact that it's this shared object, and it's the kind of refusal to actually take care of your fellow academics or scientists that's shown up in that moment. So yes, I mean, Cait, thank you for identifying what I think is a kind of through line of care. For me, the standardized patient chapter is where it all comes together, where it's hardest to imagine the kind of closed system of the proxy relationship, and where some hospitals and medical schools are trying to incorporate people living with disabilities as standardized patients, to imagine a non-compulsive, compulsory able-bodiedness. And so absolutely, that's what the book is invested in. I don't think all proxies or every perspective on thinking about proxies gets you to that place. For me, that's where I try to take each chapter by, almost ridiculously beginning with the chamois cloth that you need to scrub your kilogram.
Thanks, Dylan, and thanks, Tarleton and Cait, for those really fascinating comments and questions. And congratulations, of course, that you also offered. Well done. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat already, or in the Q&A rather. And the first one comes from Abhinaya Osman, who says, thank you so much for the talk. In this post-COVID world, where Zoom could be thought of as a proxy for a classroom, and perhaps this book launch as a proxy for an actual launch, how do you think one can address the inequities that exist in this world built around proxies, particularly in the industry of education?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I thank you for pointing out the Proxy book launch. For me, as I think you can tell from the kinds of biases and favoritisms I show in the book summary, right? It would be to return to the kind of material and formal specificity of this arrangement, right? The fact that we're using Zoom, the fact of our little boxes, the fact of where we are actually located, whether or not we're able to turn our videos on or not, right? All of those features that actually create this specific proxy environment would tell us about this moment, right? Would tell us about the political arrangement, spatial arrangement, and kind of aesthetic arrangement of our bodies in Zoom space. I think that has already kind of exposed a number of inequities, right? There have been the stories of kind of failed proctor software that fails to detect faces that aren't as pale as mine, right? And being blamed on training data. Again, another example of the ways image technologies are attuned to a kind of prototypical whiteness, and was immediately an issue with trying to maintain academic exams in the midst of a pandemic, right? I think that precisely would be one of the crises or controversies exposed by our contemporary compulsory proxiness. So thank you for that question.
The next one we have is from Jamie Ranger, who's an LSE alumnus and DPhil candidate in politics at Oxford. He says, to what extent does the direction of a proxy changing through time, or the persistence of a particular proxy, provide theorists with concrete examples that support an account of ideology? So, for example, the Lena image supports an account of patriarchal ideology, Yodeville, American imperialist ideology, the injunction to standardization, mass commodity production, etc.
Yeah. To what extent does the direction of a proxy changing through time or the persistence of a particular proxy provide theorists with concrete examples that support an account of ideology? I mean, yes, 100%. I mean, that goes directly to what I was saying around standardization, because I mean, we can also think about standardization in different ways here, right? There's like the ISO standard or the NTSC standard that becomes a way of encoding an engineering principle, but then there's the kind of standardization that's involved in the Lena image, which nobody says like you have to use this image to demonstrate your results. It just becomes that de facto reference point or commonplace. It becomes a kind of standard that gets used again in the reproduction of actual engineering standards. And that's precisely when I was talking about the kind of normative insistence of standardization, where ideology, if we want to call it as a way of imagining the world, gets grounded in a physical artifact, but not in a way that's ever kind of static or totally stable, right? And so each of the proxy systems that I look at across the book change radically over their history, right? The Lena image gets challenged by Playboy because they own the image, right? And then it gets recuperated on the basis that it's now a scientific object and they should let them use it. Or the standardized patient program has been challenged both as being too, what do they call it? Too Hollywood, right? Because the first standardized patients are brought from the art department at USC and they're models. And so it gets treated as too squishy, right? Not serious enough, but gets eventually recuperated and encoded as exactly what you say, Jamie, as a kind of grounding of ideology in the material bodies of people who have to act out in standardized ways. Thank you. I think there's a question from Shani. Where did it go? Yeah.
I think that question might have been.
Oh no, it got upvoted. Here it is.
Oh, got
it's at the
upvoted.
top.
There we go.
It's at the top.
So Shani asks, going back to Shani Orgard from the LSE, going back to the asparagus and sandwiches cutouts, I wonder whether we can read them as a performance of instability rather than stability, or as proxies that simultaneously stand in for and literally paper over the absent thing. What are the implications of this reading for thinking about the potentially more subversive work than proxies do?
Yeah, great question, Shani. That's so good. I mean, that goes directly, to something that Cait and I have talked about a lot. The conclusion of the book is about like, how do we actually talk about infrastructure, infrastructural labor, right? And infrastructure studies is now this enormous transdisciplinary thing. And one of the principles of infrastructure studies is we look for moments of breakdown to expose how things are supposed to work. And that never quite sits well with me, because it presumes a kind of breakdown that everyone recognizes as breakdown, right? As opposed to the ongoing ways things are always broken down or barely held together. And so and it also kind of presumes a magic of perspective on the part of the academic. And so I'm interested there in thinking about proxies as more accessible entry points to the kind of infrastructural labor, infrastructural work that gets at not the performance of stability, as you point out, but the conditions of instability, right? So how can we find ways of actually documenting concealment, right? And partial concealment. And each of the examples across the book is a story of really like limited concealment. The attempt to crop the Playboy centerfold fails over and over and over again, as people say, I know you cropped it, I know where it's from, we should stop using it, right? And the attempt to scrub away contamination from the kilogram doesn't actually ever fully succeed. There's a fundamental uncertainty. So for me, this is all about getting at the labor of partial concealment. And I think nothing demonstrates that more clearly than a bunch of triangular sandwich cutouts strewn around a Boots shelf, of like how badly in this country we are failing to conceal the collapse.
Thanks, Dylan. I'm desperate to go and find some of those cutouts still. There are too many real sandwiches around now. Next question from Kat Dienberg. She is interested, Dylan, in hearing your thinking about proxies versus representations, performances, enactments, avatars. How do these metaphors help us think in relation to everything that's networked, in relation to how everything that is networked and digital relates to each other? Yeah. So the connections, I guess, between those concepts and how they shape our thinking.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kat, and something I think I'm just starting to get to as other people kind of take up some of the topics of this work, and people who aren't as oriented, or who are more oriented to, say, like ethnography, my friends in internet studies, like yourself, who are thinking about other forms of standing in, like the avatar, or even these kind, our own representations here. Again, for me, like I think, it becomes about the kind of material specificity, the kind of way that the avatar like comes to occupy space, and what it means. Like how do you actually understand that stand-in as a relational technology? Like who is it connecting and how, right? How much information does the avatar contain? Where does that information come from? I'm thinking again of a more ridiculous historical example, which is discussed in the book around the reasonable person standard, which is fundamental to common law in deciding liability and cases around, say, harassment, right? Of would a reasonable person consider this to be negligent, or would they consider this to be harassment? And in the 19th century in this country, in the UK, that reasonable person was referred to as the man on the Clapham omnibus. And Clapham in that period, which is in South London, was a suburb of London, right? Neither too rural nor too urban. And the man on the Clapham omnibus is a person who would be commuting from central London to the suburbs, right? A kind of every person who would be reasonable. So when I think of avatars and representations, I think of those sort of common reference points that still have a material specificity. Clapham in the 19th century is a very specific place that we can use to kind of decode those common avatars, common representations. Thanks, Kat.
Thanks, Dylan. We have 2 minutes left of our session, and I just wanted to finish with your quick reflections on one of the questions that's in the chat, and I guess it will have to be quick. But the ultimate in terms of proxies is a question from Mike P. Can you comment on the logical conclusion of the current technological trend where everything we know will be proxied in the form of the so-called metaverse? So a nice small question to finish off the discussion with.
Yeah, this is not the first question about the metaverse I've gotten, and I think goes to the larger point, which is not just that we are living with more proxies than ever, which maybe we are, but that the dream of the dream of virtuality is front and center in how we have to think about the contemporary politics of data, information, and labor, right? And so for me, the metaverse isn't interesting because of what it represents about Facebook's aspirations, but what it represents in terms of labor, the distribution of who will be working in the metaverse and how, right? What kinds of virtuality it enables, what kinds of care it enables or shuts down, right? And that's what when it transforms from marketing fluff into lived reality, how we'll actually understand that promise of proxiness. Thanks, Mike.
Dylan, thank you so much for a great presentation and some fascinating answers to those really great questions. Also, thanks to Tarleton and Cait for giving such insightful responses and being here indeed to share the celebrations with Dylan. In the chat, you'll see how you can order the book, which is open access. I can thoroughly recommend it. It's an extremely entertaining read, beautifully written, as Cait said, and really fascinating in terms of the way that it makes us think about these proxies that are all around us that we take for granted, but once they become visible, we have the power to start questioning exactly how they're shaping the ways that we see the world. Thank you all again for attending. Do tweet about the event using the event hashtag that I popped in the chat as well, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.